With every breath I take all of my days, I will glorify your name.
Parents, welcome to another episode of The Journey, a podcast intended to educate, equip, and entertain you as we talk about important issues facing our families. PCA is a Christ-centered, biblically based, and family-focused community of committed believers doing life together. We hope the information you hear on this podcast informs and inspires you to be a better parent. Welcome to The Journey.
Hey parents, welcome back to The Journey. I've got Erin Williams, who is our upper school counselor. Erin, always excited to sit down and talk to you about just, I sit down and kind of like ask you every year, like what's mulling over in your mind? What are you reading? Where are you going? What do our parents need to hear about? And you've got like 40 different things.
Yes,
so
always.
it's always like, how do we narrow that down to just a couple? And recently, kind of the issue of emotions, feelings has been something that you've been dealing with, kind of reading about, and you've mentioned it to me. So I kind of looked into it a little bit, and it's pretty fascinating. Because I think, from my understanding, right, it's like I probably came from a culture and a generation that really didn't deal with feelings, right? It was control your feelings. You don't need to be feeling that. And now it's the understanding that God has designed us with feelings, and we need to really better understand them and, in a sense, kind of name them, right?
Right.
So tell us a little bit about that. What do our parents need to know about kind of the new research that's out there?
Yeah, well, I agree. I think there was a generation that was like conceal or hide or don't feel. And I think they have taught the kids that we have now kind of that same type of thing. And I think in order for our physical health, for our mental health, for health in general, I think it's important to name things. And so I think the language of emotion is important. So we're not just talking about emotions, we're talking about the language of emotion.
Okay.
So I know I'm happy or sad. There's a lot of research out there that says we can name about 3 feelings when we're in the moment.
Right. So when they researched a bunch of people, they said, right, like, what are your feelings and what can you name? And people kind of identified 3.
When you're in the moment. Outside 2020 hindsight, maybe I can name a few. But when I'm feeling something, the researcher said you're either feeling, they could name happy, sad, and pissed off.
Okay.
And those were the language they gave to it.
Okay.
That's it. Those are the 3 things. That's it. That's all I can feel.
And yet you're saying, right, there's a lot more emotions that we have than that.
Well, and they're just so nuanced and they're so important because sad feels different, sounds different, is different than anguish, than grief. Excitement, happy is different than excitement or joy or elation. And they're very important. I think to name it is to kind of tame it, you know? And so it's important that we can talk, especially kids. And I think especially adolescents because they have a lot of emotions, they're feeling a lot of things, and when they don't know how to name them, they're often maybe, as we know as parents or counselors of teenagers, they're making them a lot bigger maybe than they need to be, and sometimes they're minimizing things that need to be named a little bit differently. And so I think it's just important to be able to name them correctly, which is very hard to do.
Okay.
Very hard.
So where would you start in that?
So I think how you start is kind of a couple things. I read a book by Jenny Allen, and she talks about, it's called Untangle Your Emotions, and she talks about starting from the okay, not okay. Pretty simple. Simple. Okay, not okay. Yeah. Pick one of those and then kind of delve into that. I also found this fascinating app called How I Feel. It's so good. I made my husband get on it. I made a friend of mine get on it because you can actually share things with people. And it starts from 4 categories, like high energy, low energy, high energy, unpleasant, low energy, pleasant, and however the 4 of those things go together. And then you click on one and then it opens this myriad of feelings. So if you're like low energy, pleasant, it might be like calm or relaxed. High energy, unpleasant might be anxiety, anger, fear. And so it explains each one of them. And so you can click on one, but I honestly get into that and I'm sitting with myself. It actually gives me a little reminder, hey, check in on your feelings. Okay. And so it dings me and I sit there and I'm like, okay, how am I feeling? And it's hard, but it's easier when you can start kind of with, am I okay or not okay? Am I like high energy, low energy? And then I kind of delve into it and look at them. But to find those nuanced things is hard, but it's interesting to then pick one. Where are you? It asks you where you are, who you're with, and then like what you might be doing. And then to go back and look on that and be like, okay, in the mornings, how am I normally feeling? When I'm with colleagues, how am I normally feeling? When I'm with my kid? And so it kind of charts that for you and helps you kind of learn a little bit more how to explain it.
Yep. Now, I've heard that feelings are good indicators, but they're not
Correct.
good dictators, meaning
100%.
that we don't want our feelings to master us, meaning that, right, you don't want them to be, you've kind of heard this before, right, the engine on a train of life.
100%.
You're not just following your feelings wherever they lead you, but we also don't want to suppress our feelings and ignore our feelings because God's made us, right, with an emotion, right? God's given in that. In fact, as you go through Scripture, God reveals his emotions on things,
For
right?
sure.
We see
For sure.
God's anger, we see God's wrath, we see God's joy, we see God's love, we see those things. And so I just reminded, right, when Paul was writing 1 Thessalonians, he said we're body, soul, and spirit, and soul kind of creates that mind, emotion, and will concept. And so that's the way that God created us. So helping us understand, right, what our emotions are, what our feelings are, telling us about a particular thing helps us then to go, well, I think we can look at it and say, well, is that the right emotion in a sense? Right? Why am I angry at that? Right? Why am I frustrated with that? And owning that particular concept as opposed to just stuffing it and saying, I know I'm not supposed to be angry. I know I'm not supposed to be sad. I know I'm not supposed to be whatever. It's like, well, maybe you need to look at why you are those things, right? And figure that out.
Well, and I think the next step is then, how I think emotions, yes, they were given to us by God. You're right. They're not like driving the train, but they allow us to connect. Like God made us to connect. He made us to be in community. And I think emotions and feelings are a great way to do that.
Yeah.
I always tell my students, you don't have to tell like me anything, but you have to tell somebody. Like you don't have to come to me, like you need to be in a safe place with safe people, but you need to talk to somebody. Yeah. And I think it's a beautiful way for us to connect and be in community with people, to talk about, to get in there and be vulnerable and have those conversations, which a lot of people, again, don't do. And I think people this is maybe another conversation about men versus women. I think people think that women do that better. And we are naturally more relational. I think we talk more.
Okay.
But I almost would beg to differ that men do it really well, because I've seen a lot of men get into intentional conversations and intentional groups. And I feel like once they get there, they can dig in really well. And I think women are taught, we talk a lot, we process a lot, but like really digging into those things and getting past that like first layer actually can be pretty difficult for us. And so if you can find those people, I think it's just a really good way to connect. And to, again, like now what? Like now that I have this emotion of anger or bitterness or resentfulness, like now I have a choice, right? So I feel this way and I can, and that's where this like emotion versus sin is, is it okay to be angry? Absolutely. Is it okay to go around, hurting people? Because that absolutely not.
Yeah. Scripture says don't sin in your anger. Right. But anger, obviously, we see, Jesus turning over the tables at the temple. We see an emotion of anger, right? And we see him doing something, right, because of that anger. And I think that's a concept of understanding, right, that anger can drive you to fight for those who need to be fought for themselves, right, or can't fight them for themselves, right? Anger can drive you to fight against the injustice, right? Anger can also move you towards people who you feel have, hurt you, right? And so it's kind of that, okay, what do I do with that? But suppressing emotions isn't helpful because they're eventually going to bubble up. Or depression is kind of the way of now we've suppressed it so much that we don't feel anything. And that's a terrible place to be. But what do you do with our younger kids? Let's kind of start there as we're naming those emotions and as you're talking through there, because obviously we're not saying that emotions are bad, but how do we help our kids really kind of, as you said, identify them and then to name it is to tame it, like know what to do with the emotion once they have it?
So little ones, I would say elementary school age kids there's so many good books for little ones. I would say it's easier sometimes because once you get to the adolescence, I would love for them to read books about anxiety or depression or whatever, but they're just not doing that. So, the parents are doing a lot of the work. But in elementary school, kids love to hear about this stuff. Ms. Henderson, our lower school counselor, does a great job. So many good books about, happy, sad, fear, just like your basic probably 10 emotions. And kids are really good about learning that and explaining that. When I'm talking to my kids, I try to just, hey, how are you feeling? And they'll give you I'm okay, I'm fine. or you can tell by the way they look. And then I just kind of like inquire, like I'm going to be curious about what they're feeling and then just kind of offer some things up.
Okay.
Like, are you feeling anxious? Do you know what anxious means? And then if, my son says, I don't know what anxious means. And I'm like, this is what it means. It means like you're having kind of this like, worry. Maybe you feel it in your stomach. And then they might be like, that's not what I'm feeling. Or yeah, that's exactly what I'm feeling.
Okay.
So it's just a teachable time. But in order to do that, you have to know what it is.
Yeah.
So I think, like I say about everything, it's top down. So if you don't know how to feel emotions or you don't know how to name them, it's going to be really hard to teach your kids how to name them.
So part of this is, from our parents' perspective, is a little bit of self-exploration as well. Because you've talked about anxiety as kind of a learned behavior in the home, that if you have a child who's anxious, parents, one of the things we need to look at and say, where are they learning, right, this concept of anxiety? Where do they have this stress, right? And a lot of times it comes from the home as well. So this is a good kind of like exercise for our parents to be doing, so then they can pass that on to their kids and help them work through emotions as well.
I say read the book Untangle Your Emotions by Jenny Allen. It's great. Get the app if you just want to skip the book and wanted to start exploring feelings.
Don't skip the book.
I mean, the book's great. The book, honestly, I got the book and thought, I'm a therapist. Emotions been dealing with it for decades. What could I learn? And it really, but I always am like, I can learn something from every book. And so it really kind of tapped into some things, especially that like connectedness and that community and the naming it and how important that is. One of the beautiful things, and I think this is important as we move on to like maybe middle school and high school, is when you're talking to your kids about feelings or when they're expressing their feelings to you, is the whole like not fixing it mentality as a parent.
Right.
So,
so I don't know if this is a guy-girl thing, but I know as a man, which I can only identify as a man because that's all I have. But I've been told that this is kind of a male thing when and my wife and I have these conversations and my kids as well. But when you're telling me something that you're feeling, my general response is, okay, well, let's fix it so you don't feel that way anymore. Right? As opposed to, oh, well, why do you feel that way?
Right.
I want to get rid of whatever it is, especially if it's a bad feeling, right? If it's a good feeling, I'm like, hey, that's great. I'm happy. Okay. But if it's a bad feeling, if you're sad or if you're anxious, my first response is to try to fix that as opposed to listen to the feeling and figure out, right, what do we do with that feeling and what is that telling us about the situation? So I think you're right, that concept of learning to, address the feeling first, and then maybe it's something that could be fixed, right? Can we get to that? And like we're anxious because of this. Or we're anxious because of a test. Let's study for the test. Right. Let's actually do the work. Or right, why are we anxious about this? Because I feel like I have to perform, and I feel like if I don't get a good grade, then people don't love me. Well, that's different, right? Like the fixing that is really an identity thing as opposed to studying. And so understanding what those things look like, I think, is really important. Yeah.
Well, I think also people are just anything. I mean, we're kind of wired this way to avoid pain.
Yeah.
Like, we just don't want to feel bad. We don't want to feel pain. As parents, we want our kids to feel pain. So sitting in something uncomfortable is uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Like I'm feeling sad or my kid's feeling sad. And of course we want to fix that. And so like I'm going to try my hardest. And I have learned to sit in uncomfortable feelings, which is hard. And often that makes other people uncomfortable. I'm a crier. So like if you know me, if you work with me, if you've had dinner with me, I've probably cried at some point. But I don't feel weird about that anymore because I'm just like, I'm feeling like crying.
Yeah.
And so.
Plus, we're Italian.
Yeah, plus we're Italian. Big emotion. Big emotion. Hey.
You cry and you talk with your hands.
Exactly.
Right? It's just it's the way it is. So speaking of that, there are different cultural aspects dealing with feelings, right? Because some cultures are more expressive. And some cultures are more, in a sense, I would say, like repressive, right? Shame-based cultures. We've had the concept. What do you do with that if you're a parent and you're coming from a culture, right, a background, a family that really, hey, we don't deal with emotions, we don't deal with feelings? What would you say to those parents?
Gosh, I would say, like, do you want something different for your kids?
Okay.
Like, do you want it to be the same? I mean, it's up to you, And so if you don't, I think we bend towards that, how we were brought up. I think we can look into the Word of God and see that, like you said, God and Jesus shared and talked about emotions and like maybe lean into something uncomfortable, because I guarantee if you're a parent and you have kids, they're feeling emotions. And so like, let's rally around that a little bit and let's try to like figure out how we can lead them the right way with their emotions, because we all know, I do know with kids and adults, I tell my students this all the time. If you don't let it out in healthy ways, it's going to come out sideways. Like you were talking about bubbling up. So for students, a lot of times that's panic attacks. That's maybe in lower school, headaches, stomach aches. It comes out physically. And so we have to find healthy ways.
Or as you get older, right, it can come out in things where you're suppressing the emotions, right? You're hiding them, right? So alcohol.
Right. Oh, gosh, yes.
Sexual activity, all the different things where.
Gambling, shopping,
right,
food. Yeah.
Yes, whatever you want.
Just name it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, if you're not addressing it, right, you'll feel some way to, like feed it or take care of it.
And if you don't think you're doing anything with your feelings, you're doing something with your feelings. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like you're making a choice. Yeah. And so I know it sounds like, oh, this touchy-feely, the feelings, blah, blah, blah. And I'm not saying to walk around everywhere and just like, I'm feeling anguish and say to everybody in my life.
So there are some people and some cultures where emotions, people wear them on their sleeve and like it's sort of celebrated, like how a person's doing all the time, constantly, right? Where it's like, I'm supposed to express my emotions. You're like, wow, like how do you go through the day?
It's a lot.
Right? It's a lot.
Yeah.
What would you say to parents as far as maybe they have a son or daughter which is super expressive of their emotions?
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
Man, I would say again, like you have to have the language yourself and talk to them about like, hey, we want you to be talking about this, but it's important that you choose who you talk to.
Oh, yep.
And why you're talking about it. Because a lot of people are sharing, especially teenagers, like for attention, for feedback. One of the biggest things about the language I think for students, there is a fad or, stage kids go through where they use the phrase like, I just want to kill myself.
Okay, let's talk about it.
We should.
Since you threw it out there.
I'm going to,
right?
because it's a thing.
It has become a thing.
Yes.
Where in some ways it's kind of like a, how do you even say it, right? Like, as you said, like a fad where kids will say it to other kids, right? You should just kill yourself.
Yeah.
And they literally don't mean it in terms of like, you should literally go kill yourself. But it's almost like a throwaway line, right? Erin, you're having a bad day. And it's like, oh, you got to just go kill yourself. And it's like, when we hear that, it's
terrible.
Like, whoa, like,
it's terrible.
How do we get from A to Z?
Right, because they have no language.
Because they have no language.
It's like I'm feeling complete anguish or heartbroken or all those things that they could use, but they just don't know how to do it.
Yeah.
And so they just go to the biggest thing that they know.
Yeah.
Or like, I need something from somebody. And so that's a good way to get it, is saying something really big.
Really dramatic. Are you paying attention now?
Yeah. And
yes,
you're like,
I am.
hey, I'm here. And it's just hard for adults because it's important that we know if that is something you're feeling.
Right.
But if we're just going around saying it to each other, about each other, then we don't know as adults, like what's really going on.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just really important to like say what you mean and mean what you say.
Yeah.
So,
I think it's if your son or daughter, if you're like, reading their text and they're saying, hey, go kill yourself, you need to help them have language of saying, hey, that doesn't mean what you think it means.
Right.
You need to use different language of saying, listen, I know you're having a bad day, right? How do you work through it? How do you help somebody in that? But telling somebody to go kill themselves because you're trying to say, oh, you're over dramatic, get over it, move on.
Right.
That's not a super helpful comment.
No, actually the kids should get the app. It was a college kids that, told Jenny actually about the app. And so you can actually tag up with people. And so when they, pick an emotion or whatever, you get like a notification.
Yeah.
It's like so-and-so's feeling frustrated. And so it's actually kind of a cool way to check in on people.
Yeah.
Hey, you're feeling, if you're feeling lonely or whatever, you can kind of put it in there and then it'll ding. You can actually tell it to ding certain people, but it's just a really cool way to like dig in. It's really been interesting for me too, because I'm like, I don't have as much language for my emotions either. Again, starting early is important. I mean, I grew up in a family where we had family meetings. Like we were on the opposite end. There was like a feelings chart. There was like a talking stick. It was a little much. Like, what are you using? I feel statements. But, a lot of people also say, we'll get into a conversation and they'll be like saying, oh, I'm just talking and not naming one feeling. And then as a result, they'll be like, I was just sharing my feelings. But it was just really like a dump. And so I think people really need to understand, like, actually sharing feelings means saying something like, I feel really angry or frustrated when you do this, and then let's do this.
Right.
And I think it's really cool, too, when you're talking about talking to teenagers or other people, instead of fixing it, or sometimes you can ask if they want feedback, but a really cool thing is to then back at them say, you know what, when you shared that with me, it made me feel really sad because you're going through that.
Yeah.
Just
Now,
like, or I feel really excited that you're.
Jenny does a good job in her book of
Great job.
moving between the I feel and I think statements.
Yes.
So when you share that with me, the I think statement is, here's what I would do, here's how I
Right.
would fix it, here's what I think, as opposed to I feel, right? I feel sad when you shared that with
And
me.
sometimes
because
the
you're
I
struggling.
think statements, like, that's not the time.
Right.
Like, sometimes when I'm feeling that, like, I don't really want to know, like, what you think or what you think I should do.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not there yet. And maybe I will be, but by just coming back and saying, like, oh, I feel, you know, proud or sad, or I have like 3 feelings in my wheelhouse right now. But yeah, coming back with that it feels good to know that, like, you're not just trying to fix it and that you're kind of here with me in it.
Yeah. What would you say to parents whose son or daughter is really struggling with, like, feeling just in general, right? They seem to be kind of numb. That's the every day is kind of bland. Every day's okay. Right?
Yeah.
What would you say from that particular standpoint?
Well, I think a lot of our kids can get that way
Hmm.
because of, you know, there's a lot of studies about what they call the nervous system, or like the vasovagal system. It's a big word for it. And when we're in high stress all the time, just stressed out, that's a point, and they did a study in animals. That's when animals play dead. So I've been in this high stress, high anxiety, and so now I just have no feelings at all, and that's a terrible place to be. And I think a lot of our kids get that way. Like, they're so used to being, like, in this high stress environment, and everything's going a million miles an hour, and so now I'm just, like, numbing out to it. And so we often live in these two extremes. Like, I'm either, like, all the way everything's crazy, or I'm just, like, dead to the world. And so we've got to find that middle ground. Again, that's a parent thing. That's a lifestyle thing. That's, I don't want to say balance, because I think that's too kitschy and I don't think that really exists, but, like, finding a way to make that work, because what we want to do is send these kids, elementary, middle, or high school, out into the world being well-rounded.
Right.
And so how can we teach them, not all the time can we, like, sit down and talk about our feelings and have these moments, but we can when they're available.
Right.
So I would say, first, start with yourself. Get a book, get an app, figure it out, practice with, maybe it's a spouse, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a colleague, and then talk to your kids about it when it comes up. Make it organic. You cannot, one of the biggest things I've learned as a school counselor is everything has to be organic with kids. You can't just sit them down and be like, I read this book. Let's talk about our feelings. Or a parent writes me an
Guess what
email.
we're
I'm like,
doing
your parent, it has to just be like, oh, they were in the hall, or we were at dinner, or they wanted to talk to me. A lot of kids want to talk late at night before bed. And so it's a perfect time to just, like, pepper some things in. And books, for me, give me language. Yeah. So I'm a therapist, and I have, I have this expertise, but sometimes these different books give me different language. Yeah. And so that's really helpful.
That's interesting. You said organic, but it isn't like you couldn't be intentional about creating space for it. Because I think one of the things you mentioned, our kids run at such a rapid pace and their lives are so crazy, to be able to kind of step back from that, right? To, take a family vacation retreat or something, or, mom grab your daughter, dad grab your son, whatever it is, right? And go somewhere where you give them a little bit of space to kind of decompress and then work through things, right? It doesn't just have to be organic. I mean, I'm ready to pounce. I'm ready for that moment. Yeah. It might be something where you're like, okay, let's take a weekend and just, put everything on hold for a while, or let's, find some time to actually communicate, kind of creating the space for that, right, organic to grow. Because, right, if you don't create those things, sometimes they do run at such a rapid pace. They really never
find time.
They never have time to really decompress and think about things. So I love the organic, right, but organic and intentional put together might 100%. Be super helpful.
I mean, I can organically, I say that with quotes, organically make a situation happen at school too.
Right.
It's intentional, but it's not like a sit down.
And that's why we have food in our offices.
That's why we have food. Bring them in, give them a question of the day, and let them eat a snack. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. You know what? Tell us about your questions of the day and your questions when somebody comes and gets food, because it might help parents understand just how to have some interesting dialogue and allowing kids to learn to use language about themselves and about their feelings.
Yeah. So when kids come in, I used to just hand out snacks freely until they started taking so many. And now I want kids to talk, and they do. And so when they come in, I just give them a question of the day. And so it's anything from, what's the best Christmas gift you've ever been given? Oh. What's your earliest childhood memory? I find that one fascinating. Yeah. Some kids can remember very early on, 2 years old.
It's like, 2 years ago.
Yeah. Some of them it's
when I was 14.
It's usually about 5 or 6. Right. It's, some people clue to that, or like, sometimes people come into the room and I'm like, tell me something that a character quality you love about your friend. And they have a hard time, or what's something you love about yourself. And people, it takes them a minute.
Yeah.
And it's easy to be like, oh, my hair. And I'm like, no, like a character quality. And then sometimes I can't even, like, I have to give them examples. Like,
Right.
here's examples of character qualities.
Right.
Get
You're
them talking
tremendously
about
humble.
Yeah. Give them some options and just get them talking. I mean, the question about Christmas gifts really got a lot of kids talking about different things.
Yeah.
And then they're like, oh, I forgot about that. And so then they want to kind of dig in, and it's really sweet.
Yeah. So I think helping parents understand just questions about how was your day and talking about school all the time.
Oh, gosh,
right?
please don't.
Learning to talk about other things.
Please,
And learning
yeah.
to share some of your life stories, frustrations, victories, defeats, all the different things, I think opens up the opportunity for your son or daughter to kind of
Yes.
be like, oh, so mom and dad have felt this
Yes.
way as well.
Yes.
I really think sometimes when I look at our kids and they kind of look at you and it's like, oh, you were my age once?
Yes.
And you're like, yes.
You have to pick the perfect moment for that, though, because sometimes they're like,
Oh,
you
yeah.
don't want to be the one who's like, I've been there. And they're
Right.
like, of course you have, but they do want to hear about your life and your
Yeah.
stories because, I mean, you have a lifetime of things to teach them.
Yeah.
And so definitely get into those times and find, again, you have to find rest and you have to find some margin to allow these conversations to happen. And it doesn't just have to be, I know it sounds hokey, don't just sit around talking about your emotions all the time. I don't do that, but we have created in our family and in my relationships, maybe you're the person that starts those conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe there's really good examples in the book of how to have that conversation, like with fill in the blank, super easy. Like I feel blank, and then it gives you like a whole dialogue and you can kind of just fill it in. You can start there, and then you'd be surprised the conversation that could come out of that. With your student, with your littles too. I mean, they're actually, little kids are way more in tune than you think they are.
Yes.
Yes. So do it. It also just gets you in touch. I think we become like really disembodied with cell phone usage and not being connected to people as much. And I think this kind of brings us back down to like really getting in touch with yourself and sitting there and being like, okay, how am I feeling? Like, it's been a wild experience for me too, over just like the last week.
I'm glad you brought up the disembodied thing because that really, I mean, COVID reminded us, right, that we are physical beings, we are emotional beings, we are spiritual beings, and those things, right, need to be done in community. Yeah. And when we isolate, when we insulate, when we just run hard after things and we become doers instead of beers, right, we lose in a sense the identity that Christ has given us.
Yeah.
And so that's a great reminder to us of really sitting in our feelings and naming our feelings, right, and allowing us to feel it, not just fix it. So hopefully this conversation was helpful for parents. Your resources will be helpful for parents. And I just think it's a great conversation. So
Absolutely. Feel
Erin.
your feelings, y'all.
Erin, thanks for your time. Appreciate you.
Absolutely.
Thank you for investing the time to listen to this episode of The Journey. Please take a minute to share with friends and family who will also benefit from this valuable resource. And don't forget to rate and review this podcast on your favorite podcast app. It is truly our blessing and honor to walk with you on The Journey.